The grand ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel buzzed with anticipation as Los Angeles's most influential entertainment journalists gathered for the annual Music Industry Awards press conference. Crystal chandeliers cast elegant shadows across tables laden with fine china and fresh flowers, while photographers adjusted their equipment and reporters shuffled through their prepared questions. It was February 1985, and Black Sabbath was being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, AA, recognition that had been long overdue for the pioneers of heavy metal music. At the head table sat the founding members of Black Sabbath, Tony Iommi with his quiet dignity and legendary guitar skills, Geezer Butler with his intellectual demeanor and philosophical approach to bass playing, Bill Ward behind his ever-present drumsticks, and Ozzy Osbourne, looking surprisingly subdued in a well-tailored black suit. The ceremony was meant to be a celebration of their contributions to music history, but the atmosphere in the room felt more like a trial than a tribute. The moderator, veteran music journalist Patricia Hernandez, opened the floor for questions with professional courtesy. We're here today to honor Black Sabbath's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The band has been credited with creating the heavy metal genre and influencing countless musicians over the past 15 years. Who has the first question? If you're enjoying this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. It helps us bring you more fascinating moments from music history. Several hands shot up around the room, but before Patricia could call on anyone, a voice cut through the polite murmur of the crowd. It belonged to Winston Blackwood, a music critic for the Cultural Guardian, a publication known for its conservative stance on popular music and its particular disdain for anything they deemed morally corrupting to young people. Blackwood stood without being acknowledged, his tall, thin frame towering over the seated journalists. His silver hair was slicked back perfectly, his expensive suit immaculate, and his expression carried the kind of intellectual superiority that only came from years of looking down on things he didn't understand or approve of. "Mr. Osbourne," Blackwood began, his voice carrying a British accent that made every word sound like a calculated insult. "I have a question about the so-called music your band has been inflicting upon the public for the past decade and a half." The room fell noticeably quieter. This wasn't starting like a typical press conference question. "Mr. Blackwood," Patricia interjected, "perhaps you could frame your question more professionally." No, Blackwood waved her off dismissively. "I think it's important that we address the elephant in the room. We're supposed to be celebrating the induction of Black Sabbath into an institution that's meant to honor musical achievement. But let's be honest about what Black Sabbath really represents." Ozzy's expression remained neutral, but those who knew him could see his jaw tighten slightly. Tony Iommi leaned forward, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. "What I want to know," Blackwood continued, his voice growing louder and more theatrical, "is how we can possibly call what Black Sabbath produces music at all. Isn't it really just noise? Noise designed to appeal to society's worst elements, drug addicts, delinquents, and sinners who've rejected everything decent and moral about civilized society." A shocked murmur rippled through the assembled journalists. Even by the standards of confrontational press conferences, this was extraordinarily hostile. "Furthermore," Blackwood pressed on, clearly enjoying the attention, "isn't it true that your band deliberately promotes Satanism, drug use, and rebellion against Christian values? Isn't Black Sabbath really just a vehicle for corrupting young people and leading them away from God and toward moral degradation?" The room was now completely silent except for the soft clicking of cameras, capturing what everyone sensed was about to become a significant moment. "Mr. Blackwood," Patricia tried again, "I think we should focus on questions about their musical contributions." "This is about their musical contributions," Blackwood interrupted arrogantly. "Or rather, their lack thereof. I'm asking how we can possibly celebrate musicians whose only achievement has been to create noise for sinners, cacophonous sounds that appeal only to the dregs of society." Ozzy sat perfectly still for a long moment, his hands folded in front of him on the white tablecloth. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly across the silent ballroom. "Are you finished?" he asked simply. Blackwood straightened his tie with satisfaction. "I believe I've made my point quite clearly." "Good," Ozzy replied, standing slowly from his chair, "because now I'd like to make mine. What happened next was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever witnessed at a press conference. Instead of the defensive anger or crude dismissal that many expected from the Prince of Darkness, Ozzy delivered what would later be called one of the most articulate and devastating responses in music journalism history. "Mr. Blackwood," Ozzy began, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I want to thank you for that question, not because it was insightful or intelligent, but because it perfectly demonstrates the kind of ignorance and prejudice that my bandmates and I have been fighting against for our entire careers." He walked around the table, positioning himself where the entire room could see him clearly. "You call our music noise for sinners. So let me tell you about some of those sinners, Winston." The use of the reporter's first name was deliberate and somehow made the response feel more personal, more pointed. One of those sinners is a 17-year-old girl from Detroit whose father beats her and whose mother drinks herself unconscious every night. She listens to Children of the Grave and realizes she's not alone in feeling like the world is a dangerous place. She finds strength in our lyrics about survival and hope. The room was transfixed. This wasn't the Ozzy Osbourne they expected. This was someone speaking with passion and precision about something deeply meaningful to him. Another one of those sinners is a 22-year-old factory worker from Birmingham, not far from where I grew up, who works 60 hours a week in conditions that are slowly killing him, just like they killed his father and his grandfather before him. He listens to War Pigs and understands that someone else sees the injustice in a system that treats working people like expendable machinery. Ozzy's voice grew stronger as he continued, his accent becoming more pronounced as his passion increased. "And here's another sinner for you, Winston. A 15-year-old kid from Ohio whose classmates mock him every day because he's different, because he doesn't fit in, because he dares to think for himself. He listens to Paranoid and realizes that feeling like an outsider doesn't mean there's something wrong with him. It might mean there's something wrong with a society that can't accept difference." Blackwood had gone noticeably pale, clearly not expecting this level of articulate response. "You say we promote Satanism," Ozzy continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Have you actually listened to our lyrics, Winston? Have you paid attention to what we're really saying? Because if you had, you'd know that most of our songs are warnings, not celebrations." He began pacing slightly, his energy building as he warmed to his theme. "NIB isn't about worshipping the devil. It's about how love can redeem even the darkest soul. Black Sabbath isn't promoting evil. It's describing the horror of encountering it and the importance of spiritual protection. After Forever is literally about finding God and the importance of faith." The silence in the room was complete now, every journalist hanging on his words. "But you didn't bother to actually research our music before you stood up here and made your accusations, did you? You heard the word Sabbath, saw the long hair and the leather, and decided you knew everything you needed to know about us." Ozzy stopped pacing and looked directly at Blackwood. "You want to know what we really promote, Winston? We promote thinking for yourself. We promote questioning authority, especially when that authority tries to tell you that you're worthless because of where you come from or what you look like. We promote the idea that it's okay to feel angry about injustice. It's okay to feel confused about your place in the world, and it's okay to express those feelings through music. But surely you can't deny the influence your music has had on drug use and—" Blackwood began weakly. "Stop right there," Ozzy interrupted firmly. "Let's talk about drug use, shall we? Because unlike you, I actually know what I'm talking about when it comes to that subject." The room tensed, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. "I've struggled with addiction for most of my adult life," Ozzy said, his voice becoming more intense. "I've lost friends to overdoses. I've watched talented musicians destroy themselves with substances. I've experienced firsthand the hell that addiction creates, not just for the user, but for everyone who loves them." He paused, letting that sink in. "And you know what I learned from that experience? Music doesn't create addiction, Winston. Pain creates addiction. Desperation creates addiction. The feeling that nobody understands what you're going through, that nobody cares about your struggles, that you're completely alone in the world. That's what creates addiction." Ozzy's voice rose slightly, his passion breaking through his controlled demeanor. "Our music doesn't promote drug use. It gives people an alternative to it. It gives them a way to feel understood, a way to express their pain, a way to connect with others who felt the same darkness. It offers community where society offers only judgment. He looked around the room, making eye contact with several journalists. How many letters do you think we get from fans telling us our music saved their lives? How many people have told us that hearing Sabbath Bloody Sabbath or Sweet Leaf made them feel less alone during the darkest periods of their existence? How many have said that our songs about struggle and survival gave them the strength to keep going when they wanted to give up? Blackwood tried to interject, but Ozzy wasn't finished. But you don't want to hear about that, do you? Because it doesn't fit your narrative. It's easier to blame musicians for society's problems than to address the real issues: poverty, abuse, lack of opportunity, the crushing weight of a system that tells working-class kids they don't matter and never will. The passion in Ozzy's voice was building to something approaching fury, but it was controlled fury, intellectual fury, righteous anger rather than simple rage. You sit there in your expensive suit, writing for your elite publication, and you have the audacity to judge music that speaks to people whose experiences you can't even imagine. You call them sinners and dregs, but what you really mean is that they're beneath your notice, that their pain doesn't matter, that their need for understanding and connection is somehow less valid than yours. "Now see here," Blackwood protested. "No, you see here," Ozzy shot back, his famous temper finally showing through his articulate facade. "You want to talk about sin? Let's talk about the sin of intellectual arrogance. Let's talk about the sin of dismissing entire groups of people because they don't meet your standards of respectability. Let's talk about the sin of using your platform to spread ignorance and hatred instead of understanding and compassion." The room was electric with tension. Several photographers were frantically capturing every moment of this extraordinary confrontation. "You call our music noise," Ozzy continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of 15 years of fighting these exact battles. "But noise is what happens when people refuse to listen. Noise is what you hear when you've already decided that the speaker isn't worth understanding. Music, real music, is what happens when someone opens their heart and shares their truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable or challenging." He walked closer to Blackwood, close enough that his voice could drop to a more conversational level, while still carrying throughout the silent ballroom. "Black Sabbath didn't invent the darkness we sing about, Winston. We just refused to pretend it doesn't exist. We didn't create the anger, the confusion, the sense of alienation that young people feel. We just gave it a voice. We didn't invent rebellion. We just reminded people that sometimes rebellion is the only sane response to an insane situation." Ozzy paused, studying Blackwood's face with something approaching pity. "But you wouldn't understand that, would you? Because you've never been desperate enough to need music as a lifeline. You've never been so lost that hearing someone else's pain made you feel found. You've never been so isolated that a song was the only thing standing between you and complete despair." The silence stretched on as Ozzy returned to his position behind the table, but he wasn't finished yet. "You want to know what Black Sabbath's real legacy is? It's not corruption or moral degradation. It's the knowledge that music can be a bridge between souls, that art can speak truth even when polite society wants to keep that truth hidden, and that sometimes the most profound spiritual experiences come not from hymns and prayers, but from 3 chords and the truth." He looked directly at Blackwood one final time. "So thank you for your question, Winston. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain why what we do matters, why the people who listen to our music matter, and why dismissive critics like you will never understand either. Thank you for reminding everyone in this room that the establishment's fear of new forms of expression is nothing new, and that true art always finds a way to survive and thrive despite that fear." Ozzy sat back down, his energy spent, but his message delivered with devastating clarity. The ballroom remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, one journalist began to clap, then another. Soon, the entire room except for Blackwood was applauding, not just politely, but enthusiastically, many standing to show their respect for what they had just witnessed. Blackwood, meanwhile, had turned several shades of red and was gathering his things with obvious embarrassment. He left the press conference without another word, his reputation as a serious critic severely damaged by his encounter with an adversary who had proven far more thoughtful and articulate than he had anticipated. The rest of the press conference proceeded in a completely different atmosphere. Questions focused on the band's musical innovations, their influence on subsequent generations of musicians, and their genuine contributions to popular culture. The tone was respectful, even admiring, as if Ozzy's response had reminded everyone why they were there in the first place. Later, as the band members were leaving the hotel, Tony Iommi put his hand on Ozzy's shoulder. "That was bloody brilliant, mate. I've never heard you speak like that before." "I've been thinking about those things for years," Ozzy replied quietly. "I just never had someone hand me such a perfect opportunity to say them all at once." The transcript of Ozzy's response was reprinted in newspapers and magazines around the world. Rolling Stone called it a masterclass in defending artistic integrity, while even publications that had previously dismissed heavy metal began to reconsider their positions. Music schools began using the speech as an example of how artists can articulate the value and meaning of their work. Social commentators pointed to it as a perfect example of how stereotypes and prejudices could be dismantled through thoughtful, passionate argument. But perhaps most importantly, the speech resonated with exactly the audience Ozzy had been defending, the fans who had found meaning and connection in Black Sabbath's music. Letters poured in from around the world, thanking him for standing up not just for the band, but for everyone who had ever felt dismissed or judged because of their musical preferences. Winston Blackwood, meanwhile, found his influence and credibility significantly diminished. His publication eventually let him go, and he faded into obscurity, remembered primarily as the man who had been so thoroughly demolished by Ozzy Osbourne at a press conference. Years later, when asked about that day, Ozzy would reflect on it as one of the most important moments of his career, not because of any musical achievement, but because it had given him the chance to articulate something he deeply believed, that music, real music, has the power to heal, to connect, and to transform lives. That day wasn't about defending Black Sabbath, he would say. It was about defending everyone who's ever felt like an outsider, everyone who's ever found strength in music, everyone who's ever been told their feelings don't matter. It was about standing up for the idea that art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable, and that both of those functions are equally valid and equally necessary. The confrontation became part of rock and roll legend, but more than that, it became a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to ignorance and prejudice is not anger or dismissal, but education delivered with passion and precision. It showed that behind the wild stage persona and controversial reputation was a thoughtful human being who understood exactly what his music meant and why it mattered. And for the countless fans who had found solace, strength, or simply understanding in Black Sabbath's music, it was validation that their instincts had been right all along, that what they were hearing wasn't just noise, but a voice speaking directly to their experiences and telling them they weren't alone in the darkness. Thank you for reading this powerful story about standing up for artistic integrity and the fans who find meaning in music. If it moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. It helps us continue sharing stories that remind us of the transformative power of art and the importance of defending it against those who would dismiss or diminish it.